He leaned over to his comatose wife and said something that changed their fate forever. Mark sat in a chair next to the hospital bed, his hands clasped around his face. The white light from the lamp above the bed illuminated his tired eyes, which had been searching unsuccessfully for answers for hours. Alice lay before him, her face calm, but every movement of the ventilator was a reminder that she was fighting for life. He looked up at her pale face, covered her eyes with his hand and whispered, "Why, Alice? Why didn't you say so? Why did you always put up with everything alone?" Mark stood up to come closer and gingerly touched her hand. It was cold, unmoving. Pain pierced his heart, memories surfaced in his mind like a movie he didn't want to rewatch. He remembered how she always greeted him with a smile, even on days when he brought his irritation and fatigue into the house. He remembered how she never complained when he stayed late at work again, brushing off her questions about his health. "If only I'd known it would go this far," he said quietly, closing his eyes. Mark knelt beside the bed, his face at the level of her motionless hand. He spoke in a low voice, as if she could hear. "You were better than me, Alice. I always knew that. I just didn't want to admit it. I hid behind my work, behind my fears. But now—" He fell silent. The words he'd wanted to say for a long time stuck in his throat. He suddenly realized he was afraid to be honest with her, even when she couldn't answer. The only sound in the room was the hum of the machines. After a pause, Mark made up his mind. He leaned down to her ear and whispered as if it was their biggest secret. "I loved you, but I was afraid. Afraid of your strength, your sincerity. Forgive me for that." And suddenly his gaze was caught by the slight movement of her fingers. Mark froze. Was it just me? He thought, then asked loudly. "Alice? Can you hear me?" He shuddered at the sound of his own voice breaking the dead silence. Running out of the room, he called for the nurse. "I think," she moved her hand. "Can you check?" The nurse entered, checked the vitals and said calmly. "Alas, it could have been a reflex movement, it happens. But I understand, it gives you hope." Mark lowered his eyes, but somewhere inside him there was a feeling that it was more than just a movement. He took another look at her still face. "If you can hear me, Alice," he murmured, "I'll do anything to fix this. Everything." After the nurse left, Mark remained seated in the chair, clutching his head with his hands. The hospital room was quiet, but the silence didn't bring him peace. He looked at Alice, trying to keep the memories from flooding back. Their first acquaintance flashed before his eyes. He was 27 at the time, she was a year younger. Mark had always considered himself an ambitious person, striving for success. His life consisted of well-defined plans, tasks and career goals. Alice appeared in his life by chance, at an event organized by their mutual friends. She was wearing a light blue dress, with a mop of brown hair gathered in a careless bundle. Her eyes, deep and expressive, immediately drew his gaze. She was laughing at something one of her friends was saying, and her laughter sounded like music. "You look like you're at a party for the first time," she said suddenly, noticing his gaze. Mark was embarrassed, but he found himself. "Maybe it's because it's the first time I've seen someone so colorful." Alice smiled and tilted her head slightly to the side, studying him. Her ease and openness won Mark over immediately. They spent the whole evening together, talking about everything in the world. She turned out to be not only beautiful, but also smart. Alice studied medicine, dreaming of helping people. Her passion for her work was impressive. She seemed the opposite of Mark, but that's what attracted him. From then on, their relationship grew rapidly. She was the sunshine that lit up his austere, calculating world. He became her pillar, the man who was always there to support her. They moved into a small apartment where they shared everything: joys, sorrows, dreams. But the perfect fairy tale came to an end when harsh realities intervened in their lives. Mark's career began to gain momentum, and he was increasingly delayed at work. His ambition demanded sacrifice, and as he thought at the time, Alice would understand. She had always been understanding, but her smile became more and more rare with each passing year. She stopped telling him about her studies, her dreams, and he stopped asking. Why hadn't I noticed this before? Mark whispered, looking at her again. He remembered how she had come home late one day, tired after a hard day at the hospital. She had tried to tell him about the patient she had saved, but he had interrupted her with words. Have you ever thought you could do something less stressful? Maybe you should take a break from work? He saw her eyes darken. She nodded without saying anything. At that moment, Mark thought he'd done the right thing by showing concern. But now, sitting beside her bed, he realized that he had begun to lose her then. Mark got up and walked to the window. Outside the glass was a gray, cold day. People were hurrying somewhere without noticing each other. He looked at them, remembering how their life with Alice was becoming more and more monotonous. She tried to change things. She suggested traveling, new activities, but he always found excuses. It's my whole schedule, Alice. We just don't have time, he said once. Her eyes went out again then. Mark exhaled heavily, leaning against the windowsill. He'd thought he'd done everything right, made them financially stable, made their lives comfortable. But had it been enough? Why then did she end up here, in this hospital room, and he feels so empty? Suddenly his gaze fell on a book lying on the nightstand beside Alice's bed. It was her old day planner that she always kept with her. Mark picked it up, feeling his fingers trembling. On the first page was written, "Dreams I'm sure to fulfill." His eyes ran over the entries. Learn French. Learn to play the piano. Go to Italy and see Tuscany. Open a clinic where patients feel at home. Mark felt his heart squeeze. Most of those dreams remained words on paper. He turned the page and came across a note. Understand Mark. Why does he always run forward without looking back? Maybe one day he'll realize that happiness isn't a race, but a moment here and now. Those words, written in her hand, struck him like lightning. She'd always known, but she hadn't spoken. She had been patient, trying to understand him while he was too busy trying to understand her. Mark sat down beside the bed again. He squeezed her hand tightly, as if he wanted to convey his pain and remorse to her. Alice, he said, his voice trembling, if you can hear me. I promise. I will change. I will fulfill your dreams. Just come back. Silence was his answer, but he felt it, this was not the end. It's just the beginning of a journey. The next morning, Mark woke up in the chair next to Alice's bed. His body ached from the uncomfortable posture, but the thoughts swirling in his head kept him from feeling physically tired. Rays of morning sunlight shone through the thick blinds, illuminating the room with soft light. Mark looked around, as if hoping that everything that was happening was just a bad dream. But Alice was still lying motionless, her face as calm as if she were asleep. He remembered his words from last night. I will change. I will fulfill your dreams. Those words echoed in his head, as if reminding him that there was no more backing down. Mark picked up her day planner again. He flipped through a few more pages, hoping to find something that would help him figure out where to start. His gaze stopped on an entry. When I feel lost, I always go back to my roots. Family is what gives me strength. That line made him think. Alice rarely talked about her family. He knew her parents lived far away, in a small town, and that their relationship wasn't easy. She avoided those conversations, and Mark never insisted. Maybe it's time to change that, he whispered to himself. An idea popped into his head: call Alice's parents. Maybe they needed to be close, and he needed a chance to get to know her from a different perspective. Without delay, Mark pulled out his phone and found her mother's number, which Alice had once put in his contacts, just in case. "Hello?" came the voice of an elderly woman on the other end of the line. Her voice sounded warm, but with a note of concern. "Good morning, this is Mark," he began, trying to make his voice sound confident. "Alice, she's in the hospital. She's in a coma. I thought you should know." There was a heavy pause on the other end. Mark was about to say something, but Alice's mother spoke first. "We haven't spoken in a long time. She didn't call much. But thank you for letting us know. We'll be there as soon as possible." Her voice trembled, but there was a sense of determination in it. Mark felt mixed emotions. On the one hand, he was glad they were coming, but on the other, he realized he didn't know what the meeting would look like. By noon, Natasha, Alice's best friend, appeared in the hospital room. She brought flowers and a basket of fruit, even though she knew Alice couldn't see or taste them. "I heard from the nurse that you hardly ever leave here," she said, sitting down next to her. "Is this some kind of redemption?" Mark tensed. He knew Natasha had never approved of him. Alice had once said that her friend thought he was too cold and career-oriented. "Maybe so," he answered, trying not to be provocative. "Well, we'll see how long you last," Natasha murmured. She walked over to Alice's bed, gently took her hand and whispered something that Mark couldn't hear. "If you want to help, tell me what I can do," he said, trying to sound sincere. Natasha looked at him with slight skepticism, but then softened. "If you really want to help, start with yourself. Alice deserves to see you the way you were at the beginning of your relationship. Remember how much you cared for her. Where's that Mark?" Those words struck a nerve. He remembered how once Alice had been sick and he had spent 2 days by her side, reading books and making her favorite soup. But over the years, care had given way to routine and indifference. "I'll give it a try," he answered quietly. Natasha nodded, as if for the first time she believed in his intentions. That evening Alice's parents arrived. Her mother, Elena, was a woman in her 60s, with gray hair and a stern look. Her father, Victor, a tall man with a warm smile, looked more reserved. They entered the room, and Elena went straight to her daughter's bedside. "Alice, sweetheart," her voice trembled. "We're here. We're right next to you." Mark stood back, giving them time. He noticed Victor put a reassuring hand on his wife's shoulder, but he himself looked at his daughter with pain in his eyes. "Thank you for letting us know," Victor finally said, turning to Mark. "It was the least I could do," he replied. Elena turned to him, her gaze cold and scrutinizing. "Do you know why she distanced herself from us?" she asked. Mark was taken aback. He had never thought about it, and now he realized that it might have been his contribution. I don't know. But I want to make it right," he admitted. Elena looked at him for a long moment, then said, "If you want to help, start by figuring out what's important to her." Alice had always lived with her heart, not her head. What she needed was not money, not gifts, but simple understanding. Those words echoed in his mind. He remembered her note again: "Family is strength." Mark realized he had to not just be there for her, but try to be for her what he should have been all along. He walked over to the bed, took Alice's hand and said quietly, "I'm here. And I'm not leaving until you come back. Mark spent another night in the hospital room. He sat next to Alice's bed, listening to the four monotonously counting down the time. Alice's parents were staying at a hotel nearby, and Natasha had gone home, promising to return in the morning. There was silence all around, but inside Mark a hurricane was raging. He remembered Elena's words, Alice lived with her heart, not her head. He felt ashamed of how he had often disregarded her feelings, dismissing her experiences. He began to wonder if he was the husband she deserved. At dawn, feeling that he could not sit idle any longer, Mark decided to go out for some fresh air. The hospital courtyard was empty, with only a few benches under an old oak tree standing off to the side. Mark sat down on one of them, took out his cell phone and stared at the screen for a long time before deciding to make a call. "Hi, Dad," he began uncertainly when he heard his father's voice on the other end of the line. "Mark? Are you okay?" His father's voice sounded surprised. They had rarely spoken to each other since his mother's death. Mark had always avoided conversations that might touch on painful subjects. "Not really," he answered. "Alice, she's in a coma. And I don't know what to do." There was a pause on the other end. "Son, have you finally decided to talk?" "That's progress," the father said softly. "You've never been strong in expressing your feelings. Maybe it's time for a change." Mark felt something pinch in his chest. He never thought his father would notice his inner struggle. "I wasn't the man I should have been for her," he admitted. "And now I'm afraid it's too late." "As long as she's alive, it's never too late," his father said firmly. "But you must do it sincerely. No fear, no expectations. Just be there for her, listen to your heart." Mark nodded silently, though his father couldn't see it. Their conversation reminded him that he had tried to be rational for too long, forgetting simple but important things. Back in the room, Mark saw that Helena was already sitting by Alice's bedside. She was holding her hand, whispering something quietly. Her face was focused, but tears glistened in her eyes. "Good morning," he said quietly, walking in. Elena turned around, her gaze softer than it had been yesterday. "Morning," she replied. "How are you?" "Trying to figure out what to do," Mark said honestly, taking a seat on the chair next to him. Elena was silent for a long time, as if gathering her thoughts. "I know you think Victor and I blame you. And maybe we do. But we blame ourselves most of all. We lost contact with our daughter a long time ago, and that's our fault." Mark felt a wave of guilt wash over him. He remembered how Alice had tried more than once to invite her parents to visit, but he had always found an excuse to avoid it. "She deserved better," he said quietly. "Both from you and from me." Elena nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "But since you're here, you still want to be there for her. And that's important." "Not everyone would have stayed," she said. Her words gave Mark a strange sense of relief. He realized that as long as he stayed with her, he had a chance to make a difference. Natasha returned for lunch. She had brought Alice's scrapbook full of photographs and drawings. She knew they could be the key for Mark to figure out who Alice really was. "Alice liked to preserve moments," Natasha said as she opened the album to the first page. It was her way of leaving a mark. On the first page was a snapshot of their wedding. Alice, in her white dress, with shining eyes, and Mark, not yet embittered by the daily routine, looked happy. "You know, she always believed in you," Natasha added. "Even when I said you were getting too cold," she said, "he's just lost. I'll get him back." Mark felt his heart clench. It seemed to him that Alice saw something in him that he himself hadn't noticed in a long time. He turned the page where there were pictures of Alice with her friends, her trips and everyday moments. Each picture reminded him of how bright and kind she was. If you want to help her, start by getting yourself back. The way she saw you, Natasha said as she closed the album. Mark realized that those weren't just words. They were a guide to action. Toward evening, Victor came into the room. He brought books that Alice liked to read and offered to read aloud to her. They say that people in comas can sometimes hear, he explained. Maybe this will help. Mark picked up one of the books. It was her favorite, Wuthering Heights. He sat down next to the bed and started reading. His voice was awkward at first, but gradually became more confident. Each word filled the room with warmth, as if bringing back a piece of Alice. When he finished reading the first chapter, he took her hand and said quietly, "Alice, if you can hear me, know that I am here. And I'll be here until you come back." The silence was deafening, but Mark felt that he had taken the first step toward reconciliation, both with himself and with Alice. Late at night, when everyone had left the room and the hospital had fallen into silence, Mark was alone with Alice again. The lights were dimmed, the 4 was still monotonously counting down the seconds, and somewhere in the distance was the soft hum of the night staff. He looked at Alice's face, pale, but still incredibly beautiful. He noticed every feature that had been familiar to him before but now seemed new. Her closed eyes, the soft lines of her lips, the slight shadow of her lashes, everything reminded him of how much he had missed. Mark felt he needed to do more. He could no longer remain in a state of passive observation. It seemed to him that Alice was expecting something more from him. He took her hand again, as he did every night, and whispered, "I don't know if you can hear me. But I have a confession to make. I've been a fool. I lived my life thinking that everything would hold up on its own, that you'd always be there for me no matter what. And now I realize that you were my rock. I'm sorry." The words burst out of him like a long-awaited relief. But Alice's silence remained deafening. The next morning, Mark decided to go home to clean up and get some rest. As soon as he entered the apartment, he felt the emptiness of the space pressing in on him. Everything reminded him of Alice, her plaid on the armchair, the cup of coffee on the table, the scattered books. In the corner of the room he noticed a box he had not noticed before. Opening it, he found the letters. They were the same letters Alice had written when she felt lonely, when Mark was estranged from her. He didn't know why she had saved them, but each word echoed in his heart. One letter in particular caught his attention. The envelope read, "For Mark. If I ever can't say it in person." His hands trembled as he opened the envelope. In the letter, Alice wrote about her fears, her love for him, and how she had always believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. She asked him not to be afraid to show his feelings, to be sincere, to be real. Mark closed his eyes, feeling the tears streaming down his cheeks. This letter had been something of an awakening for him. He realized that he still had a chance, however tiny, to change everything. Back at the hospital, Mark met Elena in the hallway. She noticed his reddened eyes, but said nothing. Instead, she said softly, "You look different. Has something changed?" Mark looked at her, not knowing how to explain what he was feeling. "I found her letter," he said, holding the envelope in his hands. "She knew that things might change one day, and she wanted me to understand that." Elena nodded, her face turning serious. "Then use this. Talk to her. Even if she doesn't answer, talk." In the ward, Mark sat down next to Alice. He took out the letter and began to read it aloud. His voice trembled, but he didn't stop. With each word, he felt the weight of guilt go away a little, leaving room for hope. "Alice, I don't know if you can hear this. But I promise you that I won't be the way I was again. If you come back, I'll do anything to earn your trust again." The silence seemed unbearable, but Mark no longer felt alone. It seemed to him that it was just the two of them in this room now, and their bond, however invisible, had grown stronger. In the evening Natasha came into the room. She noticed that Mark looked calmer than before. Had something happened? She asked, sitting down next to him. Mark told her about the letter. Natasha listened attentively and then said, "It's good that you've finally realized what's important to her. But you have to be prepared that even if she comes back, things won't be the same." Mark nodded. He knew he had a long road ahead of him, but for the first time in a long time he felt ready to walk it. At night, as the hospital slipped back into silence, Mark sat by Alice's bedside. He held her hand and whispered softly, "You always said that love is action. Now, I'm ready to take action. Just give me a chance." And at that moment he thought Alice's fingers moved slightly. Mark held his breath, looking at Alice's hand. It seemed to him that her fingers clenched slightly, a subtle movement that might have been an accident. Or was it the first sign that she could hear him? Mark's heart beat faster, and he called for the nurse. "Please check her. I thought she moved her fingers." Mark's voice was filled with a mixture of excitement and fear. The nurse walked over to Alice and examined her professionally. She was in no hurry to please Mark, remaining focused. "It happens," she said calmly, "but it is not always an indication of recovery. We will monitor the dynamics." Mark stayed by the bedside while the nurse went out. He took Alice's hand in his own again, feeling defenseless against the unknown. "Alice, if this is you, if you can hear me, I'm begging you, keep fighting. I know I've been selfish, but now I realize how much you mean to me. I only ask one thing, come back." His voice trembled, but there was hardness in it. He spoke as he never had before, as if his every thought reached Alice, even if she couldn't answer. The next morning, Mark met Dr. Anton in the hallway. Anton was one of the hospital's top specialists, and he was the one Mark trusted the most. "Doctor, I'm pretty sure Alice wiggled her fingers. Can you do further tests?" Mark asked, his face expressing a mixture of pleading and hope. Anton looked at him carefully. "We'll do our best to understand what's going on. But, Mark, I must remind you, sometimes it can be just a reflex, unrelated to the patient's consciousness." Those words were like a blow under the breath, but Mark refused to lose faith. He realized that he might be wrong, but the desire to save Allison's world was more important to him than anything else. Natasha arrived at the hospital again that day. She found Mark in the hospital cafeteria, where he was sitting with a cup of coffee, immersed in his thoughts. "I heard from the nurse that there had been some changes." "Tell me about it," Natasha asked, sitting down across from him. Mark told her about the movement of his fingers, about his hope, which had become a new goal for him. "This could be the beginning, Natasha." "I have to believe it," he said, not taking his eyes off her face. Natasha hesitated for a moment. She knew that hope was a powerful tool, but at the same time she was afraid that Mark was clinging too much to the illusion. "It's good that you believe," she said. "But, Mark, you have to prepare for every outcome. Hope is fine, but reality can be more difficult." Mark nodded, though her words hurt him. He realized Natasha was right, but at the same time he refused to allow himself to doubt. That evening he sat by Alice's bedside again, reading to her the very letter he had found. He read it over and over, each word filled with more and more emotional depth. It seemed to him that those were the words that could help her find her way back. "You always said we had a chance to change things if we wanted to," he said, his voice soft but filled with determination. "Alice, I want you back. We can start over." The next night, when Mark was at her bedside again, he felt her fingers press a little harder into his palm. It was a subtle movement, but this time he knew he wasn't wrong. He rose abruptly, calling for the nurse. This time they called for Dr. Anton, who quickly examined the patient. His face remained professionally calm, but there was a spark of interest in his eyes. "That's a good sign," Anton said after the examination. "We will continue to observe. But I recommend that you stay close to her and keep talking to her. Sometimes the voice of a loved one really helps." These words filled Mark with new hope. He realized that his role in Alice's recovery was far greater than he had realized. The next few days were a turning point for Mark and Alice. He spent more and more time at her bedside, telling her his thoughts, the plans he wanted to make with her. He talked about what they should do after her recovery, traveling, family holidays, all the things they had deprived themselves of because of the hustle and bustle of everyday life. And every time he felt the slight movement of her hand, his faith grew stronger. Late that night, Mark said, "Alice, I know we've had a lot of difficulties. But if you come back to me, I'll do anything to right the wrongs. You're my life. And I will never let myself forget that again." It seemed to him that her eyelids fluttered slightly. It was a brief, almost imperceptible movement, but he saw it. This time he knew for sure. Mark held his breath, not taking his eyes off Alice's face. It seemed to him that her eyelids fluttered again. He sat as if mesmerized, afraid to make an extra movement lest he disturb this fragile moment. "Alice? Is that you?" he whispered, leaning closer. He gently placed his hand on hers, feeling the warmth of her skin. His heart beat so loudly that it seemed to echo through the room. Another subtle movement of her fingers spurred Mark into action. "Nurse!" he called, and his voice echoed down the hallway. The nurse on duty entered the room immediately. Her calm expression changed to one of professional interest when she saw Alice's condition. "Did something happen?" she asked, approaching the bed. Her fingers moved. "I saw her move her hand, and her eyelids, they fluttered," Mark replied, his voice full of both excitement and fear. The nurse took Alice's wrist, checking her pulse and reaction. She pointed a small flashlight at the patient's eyes, and Mark noticed how the pupils subtly reacted to the light. "That's good," the nurse said softly. "Perhaps her brain is beginning to awaken. But please don't jump to conclusions. We'll call Dr. Anton to do a more thorough examination." Mark nodded, but he couldn't hide his hope. He wanted to believe that this was the beginning of her return. He sat down by her bedside again, holding Alice's hand. Dr. Anton came in 20 minutes later. His stern gaze slid over the instruments and he examined the patient carefully. After a few minutes of analysis, he turned to Mark. "Mark, this is really progress. Her response to light shows that her brain activity is increasing. We'll be doing more tests. But I suggest you stay close and keep talking to her. Your voice may be the impetus for her recovery." Those words were a source of energy for Mark. He realized that he wasn't just waiting helplessly, he was participating in her return. He began to tell Alice everything, his thoughts, his memories, his plans for the future. The next day Natasha came to the room with a cup of hot coffee and her unfailing support. When she saw Mark, she noticed that he looked different. There was a light in his eyes that had not been there before. "How are you?" she asked, sitting down next to him. "She's responding, Nat Ash. It's unimaginable, but I feel like she can hear me." "The doctor says it's a good sign," Mark replied, his voice sounding firm but warm. Natasha smiled, putting her hand on his shoulder encouragingly. "You're good, Mark. She feels your love, and it helps her to fight." They spent some time in silence, which no longer seemed oppressive. Natasha looked at Alice and felt their bond grow stronger, even in her stillness. Mark decided to continue reading Alice her favorite books. He chose a novel that she always reread on the weekends. His voice was calm and steady, but filled with sincere emotion. Every now and then he noticed her eyelids twitching slightly, as if she was trying to answer him. "You know, Alice," he said one day, closing the book, "I've never said this to you before. But I've always admired your strength. You're the person who inspired me, even when I was too stubborn to admit it." He leaned closer, his voice quieter. "If you can hear me, please give me a sign. I'll never leave you alone again." And at that moment, he felt the light squeeze of her fingers again. Mark froze. His eyes filled with tears, but he continued to hold her hand as if he was afraid of missing this moment. Dr. Anton, who came in later, ran more tests and confirmed that Alice was indeed beginning to come out of her coma. Her response to stimuli was becoming more and more apparent. "We're on the right track, Mark," he said. "But the process may take time. Don't lose patience." Mark felt some of the weight on his shoulders disappear. He looked at Alice, who still lay motionless, but now seemed so close. In her face he saw a reflection of their shared journey, full of difficulty but still open to hope. Mark spent every day with Alice, talking to her, reading her favorite poems, telling her how he dreamed of a new beginning for the two of them. He remembered the moments they had spent together, trying to show her how much their memories meant to him. Time passed, but Mark knew he was no longer alone in this struggle. Alice, even in her stillness, was giving signs that told him she was here with him. And he was willing to wait as long as it took to get her back. The morning began with a soft light that filtered through the blinds of the room. Mark was sitting in a chair by the bed, holding Alice's hand as usual. His eyes were full of fatigue, but a spark of hope burned in them. Today, he sensed that something was going to change. Her reactions were becoming more and more apparent, and Mark knew Alice was struggling. A nurse entered the room to check on the patient's condition. She smiled at Mark, noticing how he wouldn't leave his wife's side for a minute. "You're a real hero, you know," she said, adjusting Alice's sheets. "It felt like she could hear you." Mark smiled back. "I'm not a hero. I just want her back," he replied quietly, looking at Alice's face. A little later, Dr. Anton entered the room. His usually reserved gaze this time radiated cautious optimism. "Mark, we're going to try more stimulation today. Alice is showing signs of activity, and I think it's time for a new step. We're going to hook her up to special equipment to stimulate her brain and assess her level of awakening," he said. Mark nodded. His heart was racing and he could barely contain his emotions. This was the step forward he had been waiting for. When the equipment was hooked up, Mark sat next to him, watching as the medical team carefully adjusted the instruments. Dr. Anton explained each action to him, but the doctor's words seemed to pass him by. All that mattered to Mark was the look on Alice's face. For the first few minutes, nothing happened. Mark sat clutching her hand, trying not to give in to frustration. But suddenly the monitor screen flashed, registering a burst of activity. "This is what we've been waiting for," Dr. Anton muttered, his voice becoming more energetic. Mark froze. He looked at Alice again, and then noticed her lips subtly moving. "Alice? Can you hear me?" he whispered, leaning closer. And at that moment she opened her eyes. Mark felt a shiver run through his body. Her gaze was unfocused, but alive. She blinked a few times, as if trying to get used to the light. The nurse happily informed Dr. Anton that the patient had regained consciousness. "This is just the beginning," Dr. Anton said, looking at Mark. "She is still weak, and her recovery will take time. But the important thing is that she's here. She's with you." Tears streamed down Mark's face, but he ignored them. He held her hand, feeling something long lost come back. "Alice," he said softly. "You're back. You came back to me." Her first time in consciousness was spent under constant medical supervision. Alice couldn't speak yet, her body was weakened. But every time she opened her eyes and looked at Mark, he knew she was fighting. Mark stayed close to her, reading her books, telling her about the events that had happened during her absence. He started planning their future, talking about places they could go and how he would make up for all his mistakes. "I realize I've made a lot of mistakes," he said once, holding her hand. "But I know now that the most important thing in life is you. And I will never let myself forget that again." In time, Alice began to react to Mark's words. She struggled to smile, but every movement she made, every look she gave him strength. The medics were surprised at her progress, but Mark knew it was her inner strength that was helping her come back to life. One evening, as the ward fell into silence, Alice whispered softly, "I heard you." The word sounded like music to Mark. He leaned toward her, barely holding back tears. "Did you hear that? All this time?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "Not everything, but I knew you were here. You talked about the future, and it helped me come back." Mark squeezed her hand, feeling his heart fill with gratitude. "I'll be here forever. I promise." Slowly, Alice began to recover. She was learning to move again, to speak, and even to smile. Mark was there for her every step of the way. Together they were building a new life where there was no room for misunderstandings and missed chances. Although the journey was long and difficult, every day was a victory for them. Alice and Mark realized that their love, despite everything, was stronger than the circumstances. The story ends with a shot where Alice stands on her feet for the first time and Mark supports her, looking into her eyes with sincere love. Their journey is just beginning, but they know that together they can overcome anything.